The sun rose over the desert like a slow-burning verdict, casting long shadows across the salt pale, earth where the wind carried old secrets and newer fears, and beneath a sprawling cottonwood, whose branches clawed the sky as if begging forgiveness, 7 young Apache women stood bound, their boots barely touching the dust, their wrists tied behind them with coarse hemp that bit into skin, already raw from a night of terror, their breath shallow, not from pain alone, but from the weight of being made into a message, because the men who had strung the ropes believed fear was a language that traveled farther than mercy, and the town that watched from a distance, some from behind shutters, some from horseback, some from the high ridge, where the mesquite grew like gossip pretended not to hear the truth, that the land itself was screaming, that cruelty never stayed put and justice never forgot. The women were daughters and sisters, and singers of songs older than the fences that now cut the plains into squares, each of them carrying a life that had been interrupted by rifles and lies, by a sheriff's badge polished with borrowed authority and a posse fed on whiskey and rumors. And though none of the ropes were fully tightened yet, the men had left them hanging just enough to teach the lesson they wanted taught, a slow cruelty measured in minutes, a waiting meant to break spirits before bodies, while the cottonwood creaked like an old witness unable to speak. The youngest among them, barely past the age when the world still felt large and forgiving, remembered her mother's hands braiding her hair, beside a river that had since been dammed and renamed, and she counted her breaths because fear demanded order, while another, older and steadier, lifted her chin toward the sun and refused to cry, because tears were a currency she would not spend on men who could not afford her dignity. And as the dust lifted in a faint veil, the sound of hooves echoed from the west, distant and slow, the kind of sound that made men reach for their rifles and women pray without moving their lips. Earlier that night, the town council had voted with silence, which was their favorite way to decide anything hard. And the sheriff had told himself stories to sleep, stories about law and order, about raids that never happened and thefts that never occurred, about the necessity of examples and the inevitability of progress. While the cottonwood stood outside, town limits where guilt felt easier to ignore, and the 7 were led there at dawn like a parade no one admitted to attending, their names erased by the word Apache spoken like a verdict rather than a people. The rancher had not planned to ride that morning, not with the ache in his shoulder and the ledger bleeding red ink, but the land had woken him before the rooster, the same way it always did when something was wrong, and he saddled his horse without telling himself why. The way a man does when he already knows the answer and hopes to arrive too late to be responsible, riding with the sun at his back and a past that rode with him no matter how far he went, because he had once been a boy who watched a hanging and learned the wrong lesson from it, and later a man who learned the right one too late, and now he rode as someone who knew that late was a place you chose or refused. When the cottonwood came into view, he reined in, the scene striking him silent, not because he had never seen death arranged so carefully, but because he recognized the hands that had done the arranging, the knots tied with the same confidence he had seen in saloons and council rooms, the confidence of men who believed their names would be remembered as necessary, and in that moment the wind shifted and carried a song, thin but unbroken, rising from one of the women like a thread pulled from a tapestry no knife could cut, a song that did not ask for mercy but announced endurance, and it made the rancher's chest tighten as if the rope were around his own throat. The posse lingered at a distance, confident in numbers and precedent, rifles resting easy, the sheriff mounted and watchful, waiting for the sun to climb higher so the spectacle could finish without haste, and the rancher felt the weight of the choice settle, the familiar heaviness of deciding whether to become the man you can live with or the man you already are. And as his horse stamped the dust and the cottonwood groaned, the story of the 7 hovered on the edge of becoming a legend, for the wrong reasons, unless someone chose to change the ending. And if you feel that pull in your chest right now, that sense that something must be done, then stay with us and subscribe to this channel, because stories like this are not about the past alone, they are about the choices that define us when the sun is high and the wind is watching, and the ride toward justice is never as lonely as it feels. The rancher dismounted slowly, the way men do when they know every eye is on them and every movement will be remembered, his boots sinking into the dust as if the land itself were measuring his resolve, and he raised his hands not in surrender but in acknowledgement. Because there is a difference that only honest people understand, And the sheriff called out with a voice trained to sound like authority even when it shook, asking what business brought a rancher so far from his fence line. And the answer came plain and unadorned, the kind of answer that does not ask permission to exist. This business belongs to all of us, and it ends today. The posse laughed the way men laugh when they think history has already chosen their side. But laughter is a thin shield against truth, and the rancher spoke again, naming the lies for what they were, recounting the thefts that never happened, the witnesses who were paid in drink and favor, the treaty lines erased by chalk and greed. And as he spoke, the cottonwood seemed to listen, its leaves whispering like a crowd that had waited too long to hear the right words. And one by one the women lifted their heads, not because they expected rescue, but because dignity recognizes its own name. The sheriff threatened the law, and the rancher answered with consequences, not of violence but of memory, promising that names would be recorded and stories told, that the desert had a way of carrying voices farther than bullets, and that a man who hangs the innocent will eventually hang himself on the truth. And something shifted then, subtle as a change in wind, as a few men lowered their rifles, remembering sisters and daughters, and the way guilt tastes when it settles in the mouth. The rancher did not rush, because rushing belongs to fear, and instead, he walked to the cottonwood and cut the first rope, then the next, his knife steady, his hands gentle, catching each woman as she dropped and setting her feet on the ground, like a promise kept. And there were gasps and sobs, and the quiet astonishment of survival, the kind that leaves you breathless, not from lack of air but from too much life returning all at once. When the last rope fell, the sheriff spurred his horse forward, anger and panic tangled together, and the rancher met him halfway, not with a gun but with a ledger, names and dates and signatures that told a story louder than any shot. And the posse watched as the sheriff read and realized that the law he had borrowed had come due, that the rancher had allies beyond the ridge and witnesses beyond the town, and that the sun had climbed high enough to see everything. No one fired, because violence is brave only when it is honest, and this day demanded something braver. And as the sheriff turned away and rode back toward a future that would judge him harshly, the rancher knelt before the seven and asked their names, listening as each one spoke herself back into the world, and he offered water and blankets and safe passage, not as a savior but as a neighbor finally doing his part. And they accepted with the grace of people who know help does not erase harm but can still matter. The desert held the moment, storing it the way it stores rain, and the cottonwood stood lighter, unburdened of its unwilling role. And the rancher mounted again only after the women were on their way, riding escort not ahead but alongside, because leadership is not about direction alone but about company. And as they disappeared into the shimmer of heat, the land exhaled, a long breath of relief that sounded like hope. This is the part of the story where legends usually end, but we tell it this way because endings are choices too, and choosing to remember courage over cruelty is how we keep the past from repeating itself. So if this story stirred something in you, if you believe that standing up matters even when the sun is high and the crowd is watching, then subscribe to this channel and ride with us again. Because the Wild West was not just guns and gallows, it was people deciding who they would be, and every time you listen, you help keep the right stories alive.